My name is Eirene Calloway, and at 72, I have learned that humiliation ages slower than pride. I spent 4 decades curating art at the Santa Fe Museum, restoring what time had cracked and dust had hidden. I thought I understood the fragile balance between beauty and decay. But that afternoon, in a notary office lined with cedar panels and the faint scent of old paper, I realized I had only restored paintings, not people. The lawyer had barely opened his mouth when my son Rowan rose from his chair, his voice smooth and practiced, the way he used to talk to clients. "Dad's vision," he said, unfolding a document with an almost theatrical pause, "was to secure our family's future." He turned to his wife, Delia, and smiled. "So, Delia, this is for you, $9.6 million from the family trust." Applause didn't follow. Only the low hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. Then Rowan leaned toward me, sliding a small white envelope across the table. Inside was a single folded dollar bill. "You always told me to earn what I wanted," he said. "Now it's your turn." His tone carried no malice, just the cool satisfaction of a man who had rewritten the story in his favor. Delia brushed his arm and whispered, not quietly enough, "Some moms just don't measure up." The room felt smaller. The cedar walls seemed to close in, trapping the smell of champagne and ink. The lawyer Maribel Sloan, who had handled my husband's affairs for 20 years, hesitated, her eyes flicking from Rowan to the stack of unsigned forms beside her. Something about them wasn't right. Though she said nothing, I didn't speak either. I simply placed the dollar back into the envelope and folded my hands in my lap. My pulse was steady, my breath slow. The only sound was the crisp flutter of paper as Rowan raised his glass of sparkling water in a self-congratulatory toast. By the time the meeting ended, they were already laughing, Delia's perfume trailing behind them like smoke. Maribel lingered near the door, her brow drawn tight. When she finally met my eyes, she said quietly, "Mrs. Calloway, there's something we need to discuss, privately." And just like that, the room exhaled, and the silence began to change shape. When I returned home, the adobe walls seemed to breathe differently. The late afternoon light pressed through the narrow windows, coloring the rooms in muted gold. The air still held traces of linseed oil from the canvases I used to clean, and the faint musk of old paper. It was the scent of order of the life I had once shared with Harold. Now, it smelled like absence. I placed my handbag on the kitchen counter and waited for the sound of footsteps that no longer came. For years, Harold's slow, deliberate stride had filled this house with rhythm. He used to hum under his breath while cataloging his books, claiming that routine is a form of prayer. I believed him then. That night, I poured myself a cup of tea and opened the folder Maribel had handed me before I left the office. The language of the trust was clean, but not familiar. Phrases like conditional reversion and fiduciary integrity clause felt out of place, legal traps disguised as precision. The phone rang once. Maribel's voice came through, soft but direct. "Eirene," she said. "I've handled dozens of estate files, but this one, there's something unconventional about your husband's final amendment. I'd like to review it with you privately." Her tone carried the same care Harold once had when explaining things too complex for casual ears. After she hung up, I walked to the small study Harold had claimed as his own. His reading glasses still rested atop a stack of notes about vineyard acquisitions projects he never got to finish. I remembered his last conversation about Rowan, months before he passed. "He's clever, Eirene," Harold had said, "but cleverness without conscience is just a faster road to ruin." I sat at his old drafting desk, running my fingers across the leather folios. One caught my eye, a worn label in his handwriting, "Private collection, do not sell." Inside, between sketches of landscapes and purchase receipts, was a sealed envelope. My husband's handwriting curved across it, Steady despite age, for the first time since the will reading, I felt something stir that wasn't grief. It was curiosity, quiet, cautious, alive. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I slid it open carefully, half expecting to find a check or a list of instructions. Instead, there was only one line, written in Harold's deliberate script. "Look where the light never reaches." My breath caught. He'd said that to me countless times in the museum's restoration lab. When I was younger, I'd spent hours beside him under magnifying lamps, revealing pigments lost under smoke and time. He would lean close and murmur, "The truth hides in shadows, Eirene. Always look where the light never reaches." The study smelled of dust and linseed, as if he'd only just left. I turned off the desk lamp and let my eyes adjust to the dimness. The room looked different in the half-light, the bookshelf, the paintings, the desk's worn surface. I crouched by the back wall and ran my fingers along the baseboards until they brushed against a narrow seam behind the lowest shelf. Something shifted. A small steel box sat wedged behind a panel of wood, cold and unyielding in my hands. I set it on the desk and tried the drawer keys, but none fit. A knock startled me. Through the window's lace curtain, I saw Jonas Cade, our old vineyard manager, standing in the fading light. His broad shoulders carried the wear of years, but his eyes still held that quiet steadiness. Maribel called. He said when I opened the door, "Said you might need a hand." Together we worked until the lock gave a soft metallic sigh. Inside lay a flash drive, a notarized trust schedule, and a second note. If misuse or self-dealing occurs within 12 months, all assets revert to the surviving spouse. I read the clause twice, the words slow to settle. My heart thudded once steady, deliberate. The $9.6 million wasn't a gift. It was a condition waiting to be broken. Jonas looked at me, brow furrowed. "You think he knew they'd fail the test?" I didn't answer. I only folded the papers back into the box. My fingers steadier than they had been in weeks. Something in me had shifted from grief to resolve. 2 days later, I drove the old Buick up the long dirt road that led to Rowan's ranch. The air shimmered with heat, the kind that makes everything look slightly unreal. I had called earlier, saying I wanted to drop off a few family antiques, Harold's silver frame, a few of my grandmother's vases. It was a harmless reason, or so it sounded. Delia met me at the door, her perfume arriving before her smile. "Mother Calloway," she said, the title rolling off her tongue like a practiced courtesy. "You caught us in the middle of renovations. Come see what we've done." The house had once been Harold's pride, a simple adobe with wide porches that let the desert breathe. Now it gleamed with imported marble, steel-framed windows, and chandeliers that belonged in hotels, not homes. Delia guided me through every corner, narrating costs and brands as if reading a victory speech. "Imported Carrara," she said, brushing her manicured hand along the countertop. "Rowan insists on the best. The vineyard will double in value once the investors see this." In the corner, a stack of ledgers caught my eye half open, pages dog-eared. I pretended to admire a painting while glancing at the signatures. Several invoices bore the name Delia Vance, LLC, and the same address as the family trust. The ink was fresh. Jonas arrived a few minutes later, claiming he needed Rowan's approval for a supply delivery. He greeted me with the polite indifference of a longtime employee, but when Delia's phone rang and she stepped away, he subtly lifted his camera phone, clicking quick photos of the ledgers. Neither of us spoke. When I rose to leave, Delia clasped my arm lightly. "You'll see, Eirene," she said with that bright, hollow confidence. "Rowan's making the vineyard a legacy." Outside, the desert wind pressed against my scarf, carrying the scent of dust and grapes beginning to dry on their vines. I looked back at the grand new house, its pale stone glaring in the sun. The vineyard used to breathe better before the concrete, I said softly, more to the wind than to her, and walked to my car. Maribel arrived one morning just after sunrise, carrying a folder that looked too thin for the weight it held. We sat in my kitchen, steam rising from the 2 cups of coffee she'd insisted on brewing herself. "I'd like you to meet someone," she said, "a specialist in tracing misused trust assets. Quiet, efficient. His name is Peter Lang." That afternoon, Peter joined us, a man in his 50s with careful manners and the unhurried tone of someone who preferred numbers to people. He spread his laptop open on the table, its screen reflecting the pale desert light. "We'll start simple," he said. "Vendor payments, LLC filings, anything that smells off." Within a week, patterns began to surface. A shell company registered under Delia's maiden name, another under an alias that matched Rowan's initials. Loan transfers without collateral. Vineyard valuations inflated 3-fold on paper, then funneled through a side account. Each discovery left a faint pulse of vindication in my chest, though I said nothing. Outside our quiet work, Rowan's public life bloomed. His face appeared in a regional business magazine under the headline, "Santa Fe's Legacy Investor." In one photo, he stood before the remodeled ranch, a champagne flute in hand, Delia at his side. The caption read, "A son fulfilling his father's dream." Delia was busier still, hosting charity luncheons and art auctions, her name printed on glossy invitations I began receiving out of obligation. I attended none of them. I preferred the silence of my study, where the lockbox sat beneath the lamp, its documents safe and patient. Some evenings, Jonas would stop by to check the vines, his boots leaving faint trails of dust by the porch. We spoke little. Waiting was its own language. Harold used to say that proof, like wine, needed airtime to breathe, to reveal its true body. So I waited. I let the evidence ripen. Unbothered by the noise of their success, the louder they celebrated, the clearer the truth began to sound. By late spring, the headlines had begun to shift. Quietly, at first. Small notices buried in business sections about pending audits and irregular filings. Then louder, with names attached. The Calloway Trust. The Calloway Vineyard. Rowan Calloway. Managing partner. Jonas brought me a folded newspaper one morning, the ink still fresh. "It's starting," he said. I didn't need to read it. The rhythm of downfall was something you could feel before you saw it. By the end of the week, Maribel's office was receiving calls from investigators asking for background documentation. She called to inform me, her tone steady but edged. "He reached out to me this morning," she said, "wanted me to clarify some transactions." I told him I couldn't represent him. Conflict of interest. I could picture the way Rowan would have sounded, calm first, then brittle. He'd always believed charm could rewrite truth. That evening, the phone rang again. It was Delia. Her voice cracked like fine china. "You jinxed us," she said. "Ever since you came here, everything's been falling apart. The banks are calling. The audits won't stop." I didn't argue. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like victory, and victory felt hollow. I simply told her I hoped she'd learn to read the fine print before signing anything again. She hung up without another word. When the house fell silent again, I opened an old box of cassette tapes Harold had kept from the early years. Between them was a small recorder I hadn't touched in decades. I pressed play, and the room filled with the ghost of my son's voice, Rowan, at 7, soft and sleepy. "Mom, are you awake?" he asked. The sound grainy but alive. I had a bad dream. My throat tightened. I let the tears come quietly. No resistance. No shame. It wasn't grief for the man he'd become, but for the boy I'd once held, the one who still believed I could chase away monsters. Outside, the wind shifted over the desert hills, carrying a silence too deep to name. The call came early, just after dawn, when the desert light was still soft and unsure of itself. Maribel's voice was calm but final. "It's done," she said. "The court approved the motion last night. The reversion clause is activated. Every asset under the Calloway Trust is frozen pending transfer." I thanked her, though my voice came out quieter than I expected. Years of waiting had collapsed into one precise moment, and it felt neither triumphant nor cruel, just inevitable. By mid-morning, the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the calm. I looked out the window and saw Rowan's SUV throwing up a cloud of pale dust as it sped toward the house. He didn't knock. The door flew open, and his voice filled the kitchen before I could stand. "What did you do?" he shouted. "They froze everything. The accounts, the vineyard. Delia's credit cards don't even work." "You went to them, didn't you? You and that lawyer." I stayed seated, one hand resting on the table beside my cup of tea. "I didn't need to go anywhere," I said. "You forged your own chain. Son, I only watched you polish it." He stared at me, disbelief curdling into something darker. His face, once so quick to charm, now twisted with fear and anger. "You think you've won? You've ruined us, your own family?" "Families ruin themselves," I said. "The rest is paperwork." For a moment, his shoulders trembled, and the mask of certainty he'd worn for years fell away. He looked smaller, almost young again, and for a heartbeat I wished I could reach for him. But then Delia's horn blared outside, sharp and impatient. Rowan turned without another word, slamming the screen door behind him through the window. I watched their car fishtail on the dirt road before disappearing into the sunlit haze. The silence that followed was deep and complete. I stood, poured the untouched tea into the sink, and opened the window. The air that entered was warm, edged with dust and freedom. The probate court in Santa Fe smelled faintly of old pine and paper. Morning light streamed through high windows, pooling against the polished floor like liquid gold. I sat beside Maribel at the front bench, her posture composed, her silver hair coiled neatly at her collar. Across the aisle, Rowan and Delia whispered to each other, their lawyer shifting nervously through a stack of files that already meant nothing. Judge Aldridge, a man with kind eyes and a clipped voice, called the session to order. The murmurs faded as Maribel rose. "Your Honor," she began, "we are here to finalize the activation of the reversion clause in the Calloway Trust, as required by statute. I have brought the sealed personal letter left by the grantor, Mr. Harold Calloway, to be read into record." She broke the seal with a deliberate motion. The courtroom stilled. Even the sound of papers settling ceased. Maribel's voice, though calm, carried a weight that filled every corner of the room. "To those who mock humility, may wealth be their teacher. To those who kept faith, may peace be their reward. I leave not riches but reflection, for character outlives fortune. Let this estate return to the one who never sold its soul." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came a soft gasp from the gallery, a rustle of realization that swept through the room like a gust of air. Rowan's head dropped forward, his hands gripping the table's edge. Delia pushed back her chair with a sharp scrape and stood. Her heels struck the tile as she strode out, leaving behind the echo of fury and perfume. The judge nodded once. "The reversion clause stands. All properties, holdings, and accounts are hereby transferred to Mrs. Eirene Calloway." Maribel placed a quiet hand over mine, her skin warm against my trembling fingers. I didn't look at Rowan. There was nothing left to say that the letter hadn't already spoken. Outside, the sun hit the courthouse steps with a clean, white light. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of the air change like a door opening, wide and soundless. Summer came quietly that year, soft and windless. The papers arrived in neat envelopes, bankruptcy filings, foreclosure notices, asset liquidations. Rowan's name appeared again, this time not in magazines, but in court records. Delia filed for separation soon after, her attorney citing irreconcilable differences and financial misrepresentation. It read like a press release for an ending that had been rehearsed long before it was spoken. I didn't celebrate. Justice. I'd learned. Never tastes sweet, only clean. What remained was work, and the vineyard had been waiting for years. Jonas and I returned to the land at dawns that smelled of clay and dew, pruning back the tangled rows, clearing the dust from the irrigation lines. The vines were stubborn, but they still clung to the soil as if remembering who had once tended them. We renamed it La Luz Vieja, the Old Light. It was Harold's phrase. From the days when he'd rise before sunrise just to catch the first shimmer across the grapes. Old light, he used to say, is the kind that forgives the dark. By early autumn, the first harvest was bottled. The labels were cream-colored. Simple. Printed with the vineyard's new name and a single handwritten line I added myself. Roots, remember. I sent one crate to Rowan's small apartment in Albuquerque, care of his building's manager. There was no letter inside, no note of triumph, only the bottles, each sealed tight, each holding the weight of years neither of us could return to. That evening, I stood at the porch and watched the horizon blur into gold. Jonas lingered by the gate, wiping dust from his hat. "It's good wine," he said. "Better than last time." "Maybe because it's honest this time," I replied. He smiled faintly, then left me with the quiet. The air smelled of cedar and ripened fruit. Somewhere beyond the hills, my son was tasting the harvest of what he'd sown. I hoped he found in it not bitterness, but truth, sharp, clear, and impossible to mistake. Autumn settled gently over Santa Fe, tinting the hills the color of copper and smoke. The vineyard thrived again, rows of vines stretching like green veins through the pale earth. In the evenings, the air cooled just enough to invite company. That night, I hosted a small gathering. No reporters, no heirs, no transactions. Just a few local artists and two of Maribel's law students, eager to hear stories about the cases that shaped old estates and the people who survived them. The porch smelled of sage and roasted corn. Lanterns hung from the beams, their glass trembling with light. Maribel arrived early, her laughter soft as she arranged plates along the long wooden table. "I can't remember the last time you opened this house," she said. "I learned to open it differently," I told her. Jonas came later, carrying a crate of the latest bottles from La Luz Vieja. His boots left faint prints across the path to the gate, where the new brass plaque caught the fading sun. The letters were simple but sure. Home by invitation only. Guests wandered through the rooms, pausing at Harold's old photographs and sketches of the vineyard in its early years. Someone asked about the name. I smiled. "It means old light," I said. "The kind that finds what was hidden." When the table finally quieted, I stepped onto the porch. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains stood dark against a sky turning violet. The last traces of sunset bled into the horizon like ink on water. Behind me, laughter drifted through the open door, steady, unguarded, alive. I looked toward the vineyard, its lights flickering between rows of vines, and felt something loosen inside me. The years of silence, of waiting, of watching each one had led here, to this stillness that asked for nothing more. As the sun disappeared, the porch light blinked on, warm and automatic. I rested my hand against the brass railing and whispered into the cooling air. Peace isn't inherited, it's practiced. The house glowed softly behind me, not as a fortress anymore, but as a choice.